Chair, we have a quorum.
Wonderful. Thank you everyone for coming tonight. And the first item is the approval of the agenda. I'll accept a motion to approve the agenda for tonight. Do we have a second?
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Abstentions, motion carries. The next item is the approval of the minutes, meeting minutes from September 12th, 2023. Does anyone have any comments on the minutes? I'll accept a motion to approve the minutes from September 12th, 2023.
So move.
A first and second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say nay. Abstentions, motion carries. Lori, is there any public comment for tonight?
We did not receive any public comment, Chair Kessie.
Okay, I'll hand it over to you for a project update.
Perfect, thank you. Well, good evening, committee members. Hope you all had a good Thanksgiving, and we appreciate that you're back tonight. So during our last meeting, which was September 12th, we went over some proposed comp plan language changes and development code changes. We received your feedback, and we have revised some of the comp plan policies, goals and policies related to housing and economic policies as well. We will review those changes that we've made here in just a minute. And then we're also bringing back a couple new sections of comp plan language for your review and input. And those will be on the natural factors and local resources, and then the hazard area goals and policies. So we'll want to get feedback on those proposed changes from you. And then we also had a really good discussion last time on the landscape within parking lots. And so what we heard really was that we didn't want to kind of burden smaller developments with a lot of internal landscaping. And so we wanted to bring back some revised policy around that would apply to larger parking lots. We have a few images to show that might help you kind of visualize what that would look like. And then lastly, Beth is bringing back some revised information on our 20 and 50-year land needs. And it's also broken down to before and after the land use efficiency measures. And then, you know, the timing on that got a little delayed just because we were waiting for the Parks Master Plan final draft to be released so that we sort of knew what those park land needs were going to be. So that will be presented to Planning Commission, City Council, Parks and Rec Committee at our December 4th meeting next Monday. So we don't have a future meeting schedule set out yet for 2024, but we'll let you know when the next meeting is as soon as that gets scheduled, which should be fairly soon. And then we'll have a little bit more development code amendments that are going to Planning Commission and Council for consideration, and a little bit more comp plan work. I believe that will come back to this group. And then the remainder of this project then is really going to be staff and the consultant team working through the urban growth boundary and the urban reserves analysis. And so that will kind of take us through the majority of 2024. And then we're looking at adoption hearings in the fall of 2024. So again, thank you all for participating in our multi-year long-range planning effort. And I will hand it over to Beth and Anais.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go first on this because my part of this should be relatively small, and then we'll hand it over to Anais. I'm going to, this one, I'm going to project the packet. Oh, pardon me, sorry. Large this. Give me one moment to get my stuff together here. And so what I was planning on doing was going through this, through the packet, and focusing on the places in the housing and economic development where we had changes. And as we go through it, if you have comments on the changes or you want me to stay a few moments longer than I am, please speak up. I'll get to that page in a few moments. Just a lot of notes. Okay, so here we've got the memorandum that's in your packet that is, let me see, on page 12. It starts on page 12 of your packet. And what we've done is we've gone and we've accepted all the other changes that we made to the comprehensive plan policies from the prior meeting. So all we're going to see here are the track changes since the September meeting. So this is under, let's see, general goals for land use. We added a new goal about natural resources, especially water, should be effectively utilized and protected where necessary. That's one that we discussed a little bit. And then we made a minor change to the last one. I'm just going to give people a moment or two to catch up. And then if I don't see anybody looking like they want to comment, I see that Paul has his hand raised.
You're muted, Paul.
You would think. Number 17, I wondered if it would be appropriate to add reading, especially water should be effectively developed, utilized, and protected where necessary to support land uses.
I don't have any objection to that edit. So adding developed, utilize, and protected where necessary to support land uses. Okay. And Nicole is taking notes for us. Okay.
Just, sorry, we don't have the printed packet with page numbers, so hopefully you all found that. It's page 3 of that memo that's after the minutes.
Everybody in the right place?
I have a question for you, Lori. So I just looking through this, I was wondering, like, what kind of punch does this really have? Like, so Paul just added something that was very interesting, but comes down to it, these are just guidelines, correct?
Correct. And then the major themes do get distilled down into kind of development codes. These are very general, so this really wouldn't necessarily get distilled down into code language, but it's setting out the vision sort of essentially and priorities. And well, they're goals and policies basically of the city. The goals are more overarching. The policies are a little more specific. And then from the policies then sometimes would get distilled down into development code language.
Like, for instance, because I've attended many city council meetings, as you know, and I've never heard us go back to these.
No, no. And so this is very land use focused. So say if I receive an application where someone's proposing to change the comprehensive plan designation of a parcel of land or a region of the city, they would then have to write findings to say how the application is in concurrence with our goals and policies for whatever it applied to, whether it was economics or land use or a specific zoning district. And so that's how it gets applied. It's very land use specific as opposed to general council business.
Thank you.
Kim?
I have, Paul, could you please reread your recommendation on 17?
And
I-
unmute. My suggestion was to add after effectively, comma, developed, comma, and utilized and protected where necessary to support land uses.
And so Kim, developed would be
Oxford,
like
so.
developing new water sources, like new municipal
Right.
wells. Yeah.
And to support land uses, I guess, does that put land usage ahead of natural environment?
No, I would say that natural environment is land use. So I would say that they're, you know, it's not prioritizing.
Yeah, my
that.
suggestion was really just for alignment with the goals and objectives, not to prioritize.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Any other comments? I'm gonna go on then. Scrolling. So there's a minor change in the next page, changing older persons to seniors. A minor change about adding varying abilities with special needs and varying abilities. Let's see, and then we added a new housing goal about generally avoiding new residential land, especially high-density residential land adjacent to land zone for industrial uses, with the exception for allowing student housing development in conjunction with OMIC and PCC. This goes to a request that Kim had made about an EPA environmental justice, I think it was tool, and having a policy that aligned with that. And the piece of that tool that most related to housing was really about don't put your high density residential development in your industrial areas, essentially. So that's the policy that would align with that. And we made the exception for student housing development in conjunction with the OMEC and PCC because there is discussion of that, and that could certainly be an appropriate use. Going to continue on. All right, and so here we are looking at the goals for the suburban residential land use designation. So we edited that to say, provide opportunities for development of housing in moderate densities in areas without immediate access to public services, shopping, transportation, and other conveniences. Ensure that there are opportunities for shared transportation facilities and require sidewalks where appropriate. So it's essentially modernizing that part of that goal around suburban residential land use. Continuing on. Trying to make like Jeopardy noises. Doot, doot, doot. All right. So here we are around economic goals and policies and goals for economics. We added two goals here. Identify opportunities to support activities of the Oregon Manufacturing Innovation Center and Portland Community College to grow and diversify Scapoose's economy, and coordinate economic development with partners such as Columbia County, the Port of Columbia County, Columbia Pacific Economic Development District, Business Oregon, and other partners. We weren't trying to list all possible partners there, but get some of the more major ones in there. So that was in response to some discussion we had at the last meeting about getting some policies in there around those two. And of course, if you have other partner opportunities, you're not prohibited from it because of this policy.
Paul, do you have a question?
Yeah, not to put too fine a point on or be too parochial. And I know you don't want to list everyone. We do like to think Columbia Economic Team is a major partner, particularly given the city of Scappoose substantial role in that organization. So if it would be possible to include Columbia Economic Team,
Absolutely.
that
Certainly.
would be. Thank you.
There was no intention in excluding it.
No, I'm sure. Thank you.
Certainly. Any other comments? Okay, moving on. And then this is under, I believe, the policies related to those goals. Pardon me for zooming out. I don't mean to. Just where I'm putting my fingers here. So a couple new policies that match up with that and will include.
It's already in this one.
Oh, all right. Well, evidently we,
I don't know why it didn't make.
yeah, let's just call it, a little error. So those two match up with the prior two.
The question, this is not your highlighted. The City of Scappoose commercial designation, very south tip, the neighbor to a property that I own. And unless you guys did it afterwards, he's RR5. He never went into rezoning himself commercial with the county. So is this outside of that?
Are you talking about this parcel right here?
Well, there's two parcels there. The very southern tip, my parcel, and then there's the next south. Right there, yeah, right there. So where that little plus sign is, right down at the tip down there.
So they haven't annexed in yet. So when they,
They have no, but I'm saying like, I rezoned mine commercial.
correct,
I asked him if he wanted to do so at the time. He said no.
okay,
So he's still RR5.
right?
So use this designation for future. It has no reflection on the current zoning. Okay.
Yeah.
No,
It's a plan
it's
designation.
the comp plan designation. It just informs us so that in the future, should he annex in,
Annex
it will
as commercial.
annex in as commercial or expanded commercial. Yeah.
Are there any other questions before I go on? Okay, looking at industrial policies. Designation, I think you are right. So then next up is Anais. And this is about natural factors and local resources. And Anais, I assume you have something you want to say at the beginning of this, and then you'll just tell me when to scroll.
That sounds great. Thank you, Beth. I hope everyone can hear me all right.
We can.
So we have some suggested revisions to two chapters. The natural factors and local resources chapter, and then the one after this is about hazard areas. There is some similarity between the two chapters, and as we work through them, I think it will be clear how they are linked. You'll note that there are a number of track changes in this first chapter specifically. So I think before I go into describing the exact red lines, I'll say overall, kind of the main changes that we are seeing in this chapter are a combination of changing some language from passive to more active language. There's a bit of standardizing of terminology and words and clarifications. There's some language updates that help reflect the values in the 50-year vision statement, specifically around balancing development needs with natural resource protection and balancing recreation opportunities with wildlife habitat preservation. So we'll see that in this chapter. We also call out just the importance of maintaining and regularly updating data and information as it becomes available. That's a theme that was missing from these chapters originally that we've added to both the natural factors and the hazards area chapter. We also call out some more partnerships in both chapters, especially this one. And then there's a couple of changes where we moved one concept or one policy statement over into the hazard area chapter. So that's kind of an overview of the main changes involved here. You can start scrolling, Beth. So we started with the goals. And here, this is where we changed the language to be a bit more active. We added a policy to just imply the desire to balance development needs with natural and historic resources. We standardized some language by calling out minimizing risk to people and property. That's kind of a typical way that we speak to natural resources and hazard mitigation. And then also added some language about connecting or using open space to connect wildlife and people to nature. That echoes the sentiment from the 50-year vision statement. Any feedback or comments on these goals?
So Will these kind of feed into code development at all? So for example, if there's properties kind of down on the creek, I think that one commercial property maybe has sold.
Could you speak into your microphone?
I think maybe that one commercial property has sold down by the creek off of JP West down there, right? So there's going to be development there. We know that property floods. Will some of these factors maybe get built into code about like
Only if
how
we,
things need to get built?
yeah, only if we don't already have a development code policy on that. So our floodplain code, our riparian and fish corridor code, our overlays, already have provisions for protection of those areas. We will be looking to revise our floodplain code chapter. We're starting with the Oregon's DLCD's model floodplain code and then kind of tailoring it to the city and to our priorities. And then we're also looking at the wetlands chapter and the fish and riparian corridor and our steep slopes. So I don't know that significant changes will be made to the other sensitive lands chapters, for sure the floodplain chapter, just to bring it up to standard. But if there were anything that came out of this that we needed to update in the development code, we would do that as a part of this process. I haven't seen specific areas yet that would dictate that we need to make a change to the code based on the goal or policy language.
Any other comments before we go on?
Great. So moving on into the policies. Here we've added, let's see, scrolling. We've added policy number 2, that speaks to maintaining current local wetland and riparian inventories, floodplain mapping, steep slope mapping, and soils maps at the county level. Basically just verbalizing or articulating what already is happening. It's the importance of maintaining data and information as it becomes available. Let's see. Then we also combined a couple of policies as well where they were a little bit repetitive. So you'll see the policy 3 that was striked is now worked into policy 4, as well as original policy 2. So there's a bit of wordsmithing and combining here where it was repetitive. We also added a policy I think this is actually the policy around minimizing unnecessary erosion, was another example of combining earlier language, I think the second policy above. We also called out the Scappoose Drainage Improvement Company, just updated the language a bit there. For policy 10 that we struck, we actually moved that language further down. So I'll skip that for now. We'll see that again come up. Policy 12 here, we just expanded the language a little bit, so it was a bit more descriptive and it was a little bit easier to understand what the intent of the original language was all about.
Can I ask on 12?
Yeah.
So do we have any plans for like bikeways or that within the community, like encouraging other modes of transportation?
So in our transportation system plan, we do have designated routes that would be striped with bicycle routes on our roadways. So if a new roadway is proposed or built, we would consult with that plan to make sure that if a bicycle facility is shown, that would be built in on that roadway. That's where it's housed.
Do we have current streets that would be designated as that eventually?
Yes, yes. Yeah. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head, but yes, we do, and it is in the transportation system plan.
Anything else? Okay, so so here we are, policy 13. That actually speaks directly to the sentiment in the natural resources vision statement of the 50-year vision. So that's where we see some new content regarding balancing open space and riparian corridors, et cetera, to serve the needs of wildlife, while also balancing outdoor recreation opportunities. Policy 14, we just emphasize not only energy savings through solar orientation, but also just water conservation measures in general, including drought resistant landscaping. So kind of thinking about whole site development. The policy 15 is also new, that continues, that builds a little bit more on policy 14, but promoting innovative site and building designs that help or that reduce adverse impacts of development on steep slopes and other natural hazard areas. This is all codified to some degree in your code already, but it's important to call it out in policy language. Similar in policy 16, but that's around, right, adverse impacts on development on stream corridors more specifically. If we keep scrolling a little bit here, policy 19 is a new concept that requires or asks to develop an urban forestry plan. So that helps manage and inventory Scapoose's urban tree canopy. It also speaks to invasive species, changing climate conditions, another echo of the vision statement.
One more question.
Yeah.
Questions tonight. Is it possible for us to go so far as to prohibit planting of invasive species? We can kind of say, here are the trees we want you to plant. Is it possible for us to say, here are the things that we do not want you to plant?
We definitely have a do not plant these on our tree list. But as far as on a private site, I assume that that is something we could definitely direct developers with a do not plant list. It's not something we currently have developed. I don't know if that's something like a committee project, maybe the Parks and Rec committee might want to research and take something like that up. Certainly wouldn't be opposed to that.
Yeah, it might be nice. I mean, wouldn't want people right next to Vista Park planting a bunch of ivy, right? That could
Right,
take over.
Bamboo,
Yeah,
running bamboo.
yeah.
But that,
There could
I
be
don't,
some consideration for that maybe.
I don't think that's something you want necessarily in your comp plan policies.
No,
That would be
no.
a side project that you'd want to.
That would be somehow either in the development code or a mention in the development code, which would be, because that's what we did with the tree list, is we just said it's on file with the planning department. That allows us to easily change it as opposed to it being codified in any way whatsoever. Then you're talking about, 3 hearings, work sessions to just make a change to the tree list. So that would likely just be something we had on file that we could update routinely.
Might be good to just put it as, yeah, kind of an advisory.
Correct. That's right.
Yeah, go ahead, Brian.
New number 19. We currently have an urban forestry plan? We don't, do we?
We do, but it's mostly, I don't think it's focused really on the urban tree canopy in the way that this is written. So this would really direct kind of if council goal wanted to be created around having something like this developed, because the current forestry plan is more management of our watershed and some of the areas outside of the city.
But would this include something like ordinances where you keep down on private property?
Mhm.
I would like to not see that happen. I experienced it when I lived in Lake Oswego. We had trees lifting our driveway.
Mhm.
We tried to get permits to cut down the trees. They wouldn't give them to us. They couldn't even tell us exactly what kind of tree it was. And they basically told us, we'll pour a new driveway. And I was like, well, what's the point in doing that if the tree is going to just lift the next driveway?
Yeah.
It was also filling our gutters with slime. So, very noxious tree. And One of the things when I first came out here and I built my first building that I was just amazed at, I came out and I said, hey, there's a tree I want to cut down. What do I got to do? And they asked, well, is it in the right of way? I said, no, it's not. Cut it down. I think interfering with private owners' rights, you also have unintended effects. So there's usually a rule associated with a no tree cutting policy that if it gets over a certain size caliper at certain height elevation, like 3 or 4 feet, not to exceed 5 inches. Well, what I did after that happened is I went on my property and cut down every tree that was under that caliper size because I knew that if once they got to that caliper size, I would lose my rights as a property owner.
So we will be looking at, so council has kind of voiced their desire to increase the urban tree canopy coverage in the city. So there likely will be some development code kind of mitigation strategies for that where I don't know, it's still being looked at. We're still kind
You
of
cut one down, you have to plant somewhere else.
correct. Or fee in lieu, where the city might receive money. If you do need to cut the trees down for development, then the city would have the public benefit from that tree maybe being planted near a stream corridor or on public property in a park.
Possibly a financial compensation that some other tree can be planted somewhere else.
Correct. So it's
But
still
it's
achieving the
placed-
goal of additional tree canopy coverage, but it's not hindering development. So we want flexibility in that.
This be geared primarily to development, or would this be geared also to existing homeowners?
It would be across the board. Yeah.
Just so you know, if you don't speak into the microphone,
Sorry.
then the person
Yeah.
taking notes can't take notes.
Okay, so this would be across the board. I have some concerns. I'll just put it that.
Sure.
I'd leave it at that. I think a little of it, if it was done right, could be good, but it could also end up like Lake Oswego, where you have a tree lifting your driveway and you can't cut it down.
And that's what we'd want to avoid.
And when do you think that policy would come out? Is that as part of this project or?
It's something that Heather and I have been looking at as part of the code work.
Okay, so it'd be taken into consideration there.
I mean, hopefully we could put a notation on there or something possibly that mitigation or compensation as all, that nobody will be told they can't cut a tree down unless you want to create like a heritage tree status, which the trees in Lake Oswego were not heritage trees.
Right. We do actually have a heritage tree, a way to go about designating a tree that way, and that falls under a different category.
I'm just saying I'd like to see some sort of protection for homeowners where they're not going to be told, well, yes, it's lifting your driveway. Yes, it's filling your rain gutters with stuff that you can't get out.
Understood.
Yes, it's creating a slip and fall hazard. I also told Lake Oswego that it was creating a slip and fall hazard, which it was. We had multiple people fall in our driveway. And their answer was, we'll clean it more often. I said, well, we cleaned it very often. And they just didn't care.
Okay.
So
Oh, no, I've noted for sure that we'll
figure out a way.
is to balance that,
Yeah,
right?
if you said, well, if they had told me, if you cut this tree down, you need to cut a tree somewhere else on the plant a tree somewhere else on the property, I would have been fine with it.
Sure, exactly. That's a
But, okay.
Pat, did you have a comment?
Yes, I have a tree that I bought from Means Nursery who said it would never grow more than 32 feet. It's easily 2.5 times that. Now, how would I have known when I planted that or at any time along what the regulations with the city are?
You could just give us a call. Let us know you have a question. The planning department.
So before I planted it, I should have.
If you were curious about what our regulations were about removing that tree later on, then yeah, you could just give us a call at any time. Currently, we don't have that policy.
I understand that, but I have some concerns about private owner.
Absolutely.
How they would know what they can and can't do, and they
Right.
don't need some surprises that are expensive.
Right.
Add on to my story, I did not know the rules. And I actually cut down a couple small trees before I went after this big one because they were crowding. And then a neighbor informed me of the rules. So that's when I actually contacted the city. And I would suspect a lot of people would not know that you had to get a permit, I didn't know initially. And a lot of people out here definitely wouldn't know since there's never has been a rule that you had to have a permit.
Yeah, well, I think we'll move on. We noted, absolutely. But we'll keep going to get through this. We do have a lot of material.
I think Paul has a quick comment.
Oh, Paul.
I was just gonna ask Counselor Holmes, why is the city council pushing for this, or is this one of your goals? It sounded like it was maybe is it a goal of yours this year or next year coming up, the canopy, or do you guys have specifics on the goal?
Know if we've made it an official goal. We had
No.
a tree study
Yeah,
conducted, and we are deficient.
Yeah.
right? So it's all about urban heat island effects, how you kind of mitigate that, carbon capture. So we're like 50%, maybe we're,
Much less.
yeah, we're pretty short on the trees. So we're trying to figure out how that is urban land.
And also the tree canopy coverage in Scappoose is declining because of development.
So do we need to make that an official goal
next year? You could look at it because honestly, if we're going to go the next step to sort of develop this urban tree canopy, a full study. So that was a student study, and he provided a few, facts and went through an online program where he was able to kind of plot out where the trees were. I feel like we probably could get a more in-depth study completed. But again, if it's a goal, then that assigns staff time and money to it. So, if that were a priority and rose to the top, certainly that would be an option for a council goal to look at that a little more in depth.
So if we can go on, looking at items 20 and below.
Yeah, so here we have some language about education for addressing invasive species, implementing native drought and fire resistant plants, protecting tree health on property, etc. So an education piece there. And then finally, the goal 23 is also a new concept for elevating the health of stream corridors through stream shading to preserve cold water habitat for fish specifically. That is it for this chapter on natural factors and local resources. The next one is hazards. I guess, are there any other final thoughts or comments on the previous chapter before I move on?
Excuse me, so I assume that 19 that was struck, or, sorry, 10 that was struck will be in this section coming up?
Yeah,
That's right.
Yes.
Yes.
I guess, could we go back to the significant findings section, which there were no changes, but I did have a question about number 4.
we are actually going to be taking out the significant findings because those have been removed from the other sections in the comp plan. Because we have not updated any of these because this didn't involve any technical analysis. So those significant findings will be removed.
Okay, so I guess just in general, how is FEMA's work kind of relating to number 4 stuck out to me just because it talks about the dike land. Like that, how is FEMA's assessment and that going to all factor into
Which assessment?
how you look at the hazard areas and floodplains?
Which assessment, though, specifically were you asking about?
Oh, FEMA aren't they revising the flood?
So that's related to the dike being recertified. So there will be some increased floodplain because there's never been an in-depth study of that area of the city before. That doesn't change that doesn't change anything with the findings or the policies here. Flood mapping, as it gets revised over the years to be more reflective of current conditions, will evolve over time. But our policies that are in place just would then apply to those newly mapped areas for protection.
And that's not going to make any immediate changes to our available land inventory, buildable land?
Um, Once that map goes into effect, there will be areas mostly in the northern, northeastern part of the city, that are within the diking district. It's not a large amount of land. And so because that is not in effect right now, we cannot consider that. That's not been adopted. Those maps are not in effect. And so it will result in a change. At the time that we were to update again the housing needs analysis and buildable lands inventory, that would get taken out of the inventory.
But these things can
This is
take
just a
years.
point in time that we have to kind of use what we have at this time to move forward with this plan. In the future, that would be reflected.
And those changes, those maps can take years to get
It'll be
adopted.
years, yeah. Essentially.
Anything else before we go into the next chapter?
Great. So this next chapter is a little bit shorter. And broadly speaking, some of the major concepts that we either revised or added. Thanks for scrolling, Beth. So you'll see that we elevated the role of multi-jurisdictional coordination, and we called out some partnerships in some of these edits. Once again, we emphasize the need to regularly update and maintain data and mapping and information as we receive it. There's a bit of language clarification throughout the revisions here. We also clarified some roles, for example, calling out FEMA instead of HUD, etc. So, policies for hazard areas. Number 1 is a new policy that speaks to multi-jurisdictional coordination with Columbia County, specifically around the hazard mitigation plan that is regularly updated, and Scappoose has an active role in that. Under policy 2, we just clarified some language. We also combined, if you can scroll a little bit, Beth, we combined policy D with B, so it's a little bit more concise. Changed up city engineer and public works director. Then scrolling policy 2 here, I guess actually, my apologies, I see the numbering is off by 1. So policy 2 is actually, it should be policy 3. So we'll make sure to fix that. So similar to the previous chapter, but regularly update natural hazard data and mapping in conjunction with federal, state, and local efforts. If you continue scrolling, so policy 3 here is where policy 10 was in the previous chapter. So that's where we carried over that language, and then we just revised it slightly so it reads a little bit better. So yeah. And that was it for this hazards chapter. I'm sure the previous chapter looked like a lot, but it was significant number of track changes that probably looked like more than it actually was. Any comments or reflections on anything in this chapter?
You have a question.
Please go ahead, Kim.
On number 2, when it talks about regularly update natural hazard data and mapping in conjunction with federal and state local efforts, how often does that happen? Are we talking like the frequency of a census, like a 10-year updating? How frequently is that?
Yeah, like for instance, our current floodplain mapping was, as far as like broad scale, was in 2010. That was 13 years ago. However, there are regions of the city that get updated periodically through letter of map revisions. And that's typically where it can be either related to a development proposal, or it can just be because, there's development proposed on a particular tract of land. They know based on actual topography that the floodplain shown on the floodplain mapping is inaccurate. So they'll do a new study to remap, a particular area of the city to make it reflect current conditions. That happens occasionally. So it's not to say nothing's been looked at in 13 years, because regionally other areas are looked at in more detail, which then updates that particular panel of the map. Um, but it's whenever additional or newer data is provided, then those items will get updated. And sometimes FEMA will come in and update just on their own as well.
Are there any other questions? If not, we're going to let Anais go.
Thank
we'll
you,
go on to-
everyone, so much.
Thank you, Anais.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right, so next up is Heather to talk about development code changes for parking lot area landscaping design, landscaping standards.
Yes, good evening. Can you hear me all right? Okay. So we looked at this table last meeting and we just wanted to bring back a little bit more information regarding parking lot interior landscaping. If you'll go to the next page, Beth, I just want to call out NJ's awesome work going out and measuring these parking lots as far as how many spaces and identifying where landscaping occurs and where it does not. So these numbers to me were really telling. It was pretty clear that most larger parking lots are providing landscaping just of their own accord since we don't currently have a standard. But places like Fultano's and Peace Candle Apartments and a couple of the school lots are not, and probably could benefit from those from the heat island perspective. So if you then scroll back, Beth, thanks for being flexible on that, to the table, what we did was looked at those numbers and the average sizes of parking lots in the city and take into consideration those smaller businesses. And so if you can see that bottom row there, we are recommending that these standards would apply when you have 50 or more parking stalls. So we wanted to respect that there were concerns that smaller businesses would take a pretty big impact financially to having to add a lot more landscaping onto their site. We also went through and tried to make the standards similar to what we have in place where possible. So currently we have pretty much a 4-foot buffer of landscaping between parking and a public street. It says 4 feet per 1 linear foot or something, but it averages out to that. So if we go ahead and say 4 feet along other property lines as well, we're keeping that in the same vein as what's already existing. And then speaking to that urban tree canopy that we were talking about, requiring that there be a tree planted every so often also made a lot of sense. And it looked like 95 square feet for a typical landscape island is a pretty average size used by other jurisdictions and can support a planting of a tree. So we just carried that forward to the perimeter landscaping as well to separate the stalls from adjacent properties. And then the other area where we could look was how much landscaping within the parking lot itself. And some cities do it by number of islands per number of stalls. Others do it square feet per parking stall. It seemed like the most flexibility for a property developer would be to just have a minimum square footage per parking stall, and then some minimum dimensions for the islands themselves, which is in the far right column under Scappoose lots of 50 plus. Thank you, Beth. And that way you can really be creative with how you provide this landscaping. There might be situations where it makes sense to do some larger islands where you're going above the 95 square feet for a single loaded space or 190 for double. And that's where the cars are, face to face, double length of parking stalls in the middle of a parking lot. So we just wanted to keep it flexible, but also get a minimum standard that would effectively help with the increased tree canopy and reducing those heat island effects. Beth, if you'll click on those images and the diagram we sent, we wanted to just give a idea of what this might look like. So a colleague in my office put together a very simple diagram, but this shows that there'd be the 4 feet of landscaping around the exterior of the parking lot. So that would be adjacent to the neighboring properties and the street. And then, in fact, here it looks like she, and I didn't catch this till right now, that she has a double width along the street. So, or no, maybe that's the sidewalk. I'm sorry, that's the sidewalk. So the separated dotted, I should have had her label that. Thank you, Beth. So sidewalk adjacent to a 4-foot landscaping there. And then you can see the number of islands with trees that occur in the parking lot. They're frequent enough to have an effect of shading on quite a few of the parking spaces, but not an overwhelming number. And then I know that there was a comment of not wanting to force trees along buildings. So I made sure to make sure that the standards didn't require it and that we didn't show it along there. So you definitely don't have to put any trees adjacent to any buildings or even any landscaping. And then if you can just show those pictures, we took a couple pictures that would be sort of representative of what these islands would look like. And these are parking areas near my office in Beaverton, but that is about a double. So you see there's 2 parking stalls adjacent. So yep. So this would be the length of a double. This one looks to me a little wider than 5 feet, but you could go wider and then that would cover more of your required square footage. And then we have one more that's a single. And again, these are just representative of what we're talking about. On this one, the tree is pushed back. I wish my colleague had gotten a picture of the one with a tree that's actually in the island, but if you can imagine a tree in that island, that does look to me to be, and I think he said he measured that as a 5-foot width. So that's what we're talking about here. Any questions?
Right.
Yeah, so if I understand how you're proposing this, you would have a perimeter of trees. Every 9 foot, there would have to be a tree. Am I misunderstanding this?
1 tree for every 95 square feet. So if you look at
Okay.
so you'd really have about 9, yeah. So those trees, those strips in the middle are about 18 feet. So I guess, yeah, you could say every 9 feet you'd have a tree. That'd be a way to say that.
So I understand what we're talking about on the interior of the parking lot, but around the perimeter, if we have a tree every 10 feet, there's going to be a constant tree canopy, which some people might find great, but businesses might not find their businesses visible, where anybody could actually see them because they'd be blocked if it was on street side.
That makes sense. Yeah, I
So,
hear what you're saying.
so if we have a tree every 10 feet or even every 12, almost any tree the city is going to want us to have is going to have a canopy that's wider than 12 feet.
So along the frontage, you'd have street trees anyway, and I always allow those to count.
Right.
So then you're talking about having.
So would the street trees be separate from this? Meaning, would it be under a separate section of code?
It is a separate section of code.
So it would be
it's in the right of way.
So we wouldn't have this layered on top of that.
No, you generally, if you have your parking adjacent to a public street, already we require this. So it never really made sense to me for the reason you're bringing up, that if you can't see the business, it doesn't really make a lot of sense.
Not enhancing the building,
That's right. And so if you're providing street trees adjacent to the public road, then you could just do your shrubbery that's up to 3 feet tall, essentially, along your frontage on site and count the street trees. That's how I've applied it in the past.
Yeah, and if I can just point out too that, sorry, I should have pointed this out, the column header, the column after the cities, it is relating just to adjacent to other properties. So these aren't your street frontage parking,
right. So this is only
perimeter
adjacent to
landscaping.
so this is only adjacent to other properties.
That's right.
Not impacting
Wouldn't
around
impact
the
the
structure
sight
itself.
line.
Right.
Or the sight line from the street. Right. So street tree standards would still be required, and there wouldn't be a 95, one per every 95 square feet along the frontage of the property along the street. It would just be along other property lines.
Okay, so if you were a corner lot, and you had your building to the back,
If you're a corner lot, you'd have street trees on two
Right.
frontages.
right, and you'd have your building on the back, which would cover one side.
Mhm.
So then
Yeah,
you
you
would,
just
you have the one remaining side.
That's right.
Okay.
Right. Correct.
You probably have more experience in this than I do. What are your thoughts? Do you see this being a problem for people, or do you think it's okay?
Is the 4 foot around the perimeter, is that already in the code?
Yeah, it's only adjacent to a public street, not abutting other properties.
Okay. Yeah, the biggest thing for me is just allowing the amount of parking spaces the buildings need.
Mhm.
And sometimes, and I'm not sure, I'd have to look at this further and how many parking spaces this takes away from the business, because that's going to prohibit a lot of businesses from coming if they don't have enough parking per square foot.
Yeah, and that's why we tried to look at what was existing in Scappoose. So if you do look at that table where we had the inventory of existing Scappoose parking lots, it's the bigger developments are providing already interior landscaping without being required to. They're doing it on their own.
Just look, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
Just looking at this, I had a thought. You have it saying at 50 plus parking spots.
Mm-hmm.
But when we look at even at Feltano's Pizza, they have 56. As far as I'm concerned, Feltano's is a small business.
Mm-hmm.
I would think we would want to put the breaking. I'm okay with this as you presented it, but I'd like to raise the starting point a little higher. And I don't know if you have thoughts, Pat, on what that starting point be, 75, 70s, but let's get it away from, so that if somebody wants to build a restaurant or something like that, suddenly they're going to be categorized as a large parking consumer.
I agree with that.
Yeah, I'm okay with that. Do you have an idea in mind?
What do you think, Pat? 75 or?
75 or 100.
And then that would make it so that it was truly for the large heat islands,
Hmm.
not the small to medium sized businesses.
Mm-hmm.
Jeff?
And I think I'd point out too that most of these properties don't meet the proposed standards for the internal landscaping.
Yeah, we didn't review. It was like, did they have it or did they not? Not exactly. Yeah.
That's also another issue, is that if we start raising the cost of construction, you're going to have an artificially low supply over time. Not obviously immediately, but over decades. People wonder, well, why don't we have more of this or that? Well, you create a series of costs. Every time you add a cost, the developer is going to have to decide, can he make this work? Well, the answer is not unless he feels there's going to be a return for that. So we can have all these great ideas, but if economically it doesn't pencil out for a developer, they're just not going to build it.
That's a great question about if Fred Meyer were to build today, would they meet these requirements?
Right.
Debbie, I see you have your hand raised.
Yes, I have a question concerning tree planting on, with adjacent properties. Is there any distinction between properties of different uses, or do you want, a whole bunch of trees separating similar businesses from each other?
So-
Is this usually the landscaping is kind of to minimize impact between possibly incompatible land uses or, different properties of different zones. So I'm just wondering if there's any clarification on that, any distinction.
Yeah, so we did remove the requirement when you're sharing parking amongst the different sites, but when you're not sharing parking, we had the requirement in that you add the landscaping. And again, that's just part of trying to address the urban canopy and the heat island concerns. Apologies for the noise in the background. But yeah, so we do have the exemption when you share a parking area, but nothing for businesses of similar styles or uses.
Okay, all right, yeah, just
Okay, yeah, because again, got me thinking also another thing about planting all these trees. We're talking about water conservation too. So when you have a lot of, for tree planting, but I guess you can conserve the plant resistant, it could be drought resistant trees and stuff like that too.
That's
So,
a really good point, and we aren't proposing a type of landscaping for the ground cover or for what's at the bottom of the trees. So there could be definitely some water conservation related ideas used there. There's nothing there that's required.
okay. All right, thanks.
So I heard that we would increase the minimum number of parking stalls. I heard 75 and 100. Did this group come to a consensus on where they want to start?
I like Pat's idea, 100. It just makes it's a nice round number, and it just gets it away from the smaller things. Goodwill has 93. That's kind of teetering on the edge, but it gives you an idea of, Bi-Mart would be in that category if it was built today.
Okay.
So it seems like it kind of does separate the really big from small and medium.
What we could
Okay.
do too is we could set it at 100. And then in the future, should we do the urban forest management plan and look at this in detail, perhaps that would be a time when they could recommend additional, edits to this if needed. But
That's a good idea.
it's a starting point.
Yeah, and you'd have language in place that could easily be adjusted then at that point.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Jeff?
What's current code for parking spaces per business?
It's just based on each individual use.
Okay.
So
So like a standard office would be 1 space per 400 square feet.
restaurants 1 per 120.
Restaurants is pretty heavy
Yeah.
parking.
Yeah, so that's why I was going there.
tough,
It's just,
yeah.
everybody talks about how we want more restaurants in town. And if you create an impediment to having restaurants by creating a high parking, standard for them, not as far as spaces, but as far as what they have to put in their lot, you have conflicting goals. So then you have to decide, what is your balance? Which is more important, and then try to find a happy spot that works. But,
Yeah, I think the 100 spots speaks to that too. That gives you, if it at 120, I think that gives you a 12,000 square foot footprint of restaurant before you trigger into these. So that seems like a pretty good size restaurant.
Yeah.
Probably.
I have a question. So basically it means, so we won't have any standards up till 100?
Except what's existing, which is the
Except-
4 feet. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Right, but we already know that we're woefully low on our
Mhm.
canopy, right?
Right.
Yes.
And yet we don't have a lot of swaths of land that are so large that we have, Fred Meyer's coming in again.
Mhm.
And like the latest development, which is these 3 restaurants coming in, Taco Bell, whatever, KFC, Domino's, they'll be 3 individuals, so they won't be under this. And at the same time, we have the question of just the tree canopy plus the visual effects of, paving over paradise, as a song that was once sung. So yes, in some ways it's bad for development, but at the same time, we're also lowering the standard, right? To the point of, I hear all the time, why is Route 30 so ugly? And all the time, like from people, why isn't our town, more visually appealing? And these things are kind of against that. I'm not saying, I'm just asking, I think we should discuss it,
Well, but we do have a standard currently that it would still have. So let's take your example of the Taco Bell, whatever. It's going to have frontage on the highway, and it's going to probably have frontage on Old Portland Road. Both of those would be required to have landscaping per the city's code. So they would be landscaping. And there would be trees. It's just not getting into the interior of the parcel like this would for larger parcels. So there
But
would
we're
be trees.
woefully behind with this urban, if the canopy thing is important to us. Like our current standards have us less than 50%, what I heard. So we're basically gonna say, that's fine. It's fine.
There are always conflicts like these.
No, I'm just,
balance.
I don't have a.
But I'm glad you brought that up because you're right? We hear this all the time. And you're right. And this though is the reality of what it comes down to is what's the priority, is it for more affordable development opportunities here so that we do get some variety, or is it to preserve and enhance our tree canopy, and beautify the city? It's a balance. I don't think there's one specific right answer, but this is why we're having the conversation.
Right, but we kind of are picking stay the same. Unless we
But
get
we
something.
did make a move
unless we get
to create at least a standard around larger parking lots. So we're moving the needle some.
Would there be
Jeff?
any appetite for allowing 50 to 99 required parking stalls to have 5 square feet per parking stall required? So
Yeah.
sort of a half standard for those in between sized businesses. So you may only end up with 1 or 2 islands in the whole lot, but you'd still have something.
There's still a problem just from an economic point of view, though. If you put in these islands, you're almost for sure going to end up having to have irrigation systems to them. So once you start running irrigation lines, there's going to be a cost. The city's going to want backflow preventers on the irrigation systems. They're going to have to be certified annually. It still adds a layer of cost. I'm not saying no, but I'm saying it's not going to end up being half the cost. It's going to be some percentage more than that.
Would it already be in place though with the 4 feet along the street frontage of
Not
landscaping?
Not necessarily. You can, there's plenty of dry scaping that you can do without having irrigation.
And Jeff?
Well, I'm in agreement with having the median plan. Income and population drive development, not landscaping requirements. If the money's here, people are going to come to get it and not worry about spending. I don't know what islands cost actually. For a couple
Presumably, correct. And along that same vein, presumably, if they're coming here to develop, they would have reviewed the code and have a general understanding of the requirements before they commit.
So I pulled up that study that Portland State student did for us. Scappoose sits at about 17% tree canopy coverage compared to Lake Oswego at 47, Portland at 29.8, Milwaukee 26, Tigard 25.4, Forest Grove 23.2, Tacoma 19. So those are just some other examples, and we're sitting at 17%.
It's only 9.
The plan that Heather put together, does that sound okay?
Then go ahead and do the 50%.
Okay.
Give them a half standard, up 50 to 100.
50 to 100, yes.
It makes people happy.
And I heard what you said too about 1 tree for every 95 square feet and the canopies running into each other. And that does make a lot of sense when you're not talking about in the middle of the parking lot. So
I was talking about the perimeter.
yeah, and I think we should increase that to 190 down there in the bottom left, that when you're talking about the perimeter, you're doing 1 for every 190, if that makes sense. Lori, I'm sorry.
That would
Yeah.
be a bounce.
Yes, that is
Okay.
fine, Heather.
Okay,
Yeah.
sorry, I didn't think that all the way. Thank you, Brian, for bringing that up. That makes sense.
And Lori, what cases do we have to treat stormwater on site? Do we
But
have
what?
The stormwater on site with planter boxes, flow through planter boxes? I mean, is that in our code right now?
So, yeah, if there's not a public system, you're talking about frontage or on site?
On site.
Yes, they have to treat on site. So sometimes they can handle that. There's some underground facilities that they can put in with filters, or else a lot of times you'll see in the city that that's a surface pond.
So would that count toward this landscaping?
Possibly. I would have to think through that. If done in a way where you're still getting visually some shrubbery and a tree, that could work.
The rock gardens.
To integrate both would be great.
Because my biggest concern with this was not the economics of the cost of it, but the losing the parking spaces.
Correct.
That's what the city's requiring, and so that's what would prohibit development because it's required by the city to have parking spaces. Then the
Right.
building has to be smaller to fit all the parking spaces in, and also get the
Right.
landscaping. What makes it really tough
Yeah.
to recruit businesses.
Yeah, you have competing.
But if we have a flow through planter box, and we have to do that anyway.
Mm-hmm.
That counts toward landscaping, which would help with the canopies as well.
Mhm.
And then that'd make it work.
Yeah.
In some cases.
Yeah, no, that's a great point.
Yeah, we can make sure to write the language so it doesn't preclude that. And
Right.
then that is possible.
Any other comments?
I think we got an agreement.
Okay.
So is there anything else for Heather? If not, we will let Heather go.
Thank you, Heather.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so now for something a little different. We are going to go back to some of the numbers that we talked about earlier in the project. And there's some minor revisions. And Nicole will be ready to jump in if she needs to, if you've got questions that I can't answer, because she worked out some of these numbers for me. So revisions to land needs. So the municipal land needs.
We just quickly.
Oh, yeah.
What's in your packet in memo form is essentially being reflected in the slides now, correct?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, just fewer words. So this memo right here. Okay. So just stepping through this. So if you remember part of what we went through, I will start from a higher place, is we talked about residential land needs from your housing needs analysis, employment land needs from the economic opportunities analysis, and then the concept of other land needs, which include government land needs, parks, and then things like churches, that kind of thing. So that's where we're starting with the other land needs because we've revised these a little bit. So this piece isn't a change from what we had before. So we talked to stakeholders that indicated that Columbia County, the port, and the school district don't require new land over the next 20 years. And then we figured out that Scappoose would need 17 acres of land over the next 50 years. And so what we figured that on was the existing acreage in Scappoose, an acreage per 1,000 people. So that was 7 acres per 1,000 people. And an expected future acreage of 4.1 acres per 1,000 people. So a little more than half. In the 2023 to 2043 period, that would be about 10 acres. And then for the rest of the 50-year period, that would be about 17 acres. So what we're essentially figuring here is that you'll need some land for, say, City Hall expansion or new office space or new small facilities, but not necessarily a new big facility. And this isn't parkland. This doesn't count that. So not necessarily like a whole new wastewater treatment plant or something like that. But you might have expansions of some facilities. And we, of course, don't know exactly what they are. So Jeff, I couldn't quite tell if you had your hand up. Okay. So this is what we talked about before. There's no change to this. All right, so revised land needs for parks. Through the parks master planning process, they eventually came to the conclusion that the current parks master plan does not show that there would be need for new parkland within the 20-year period. All of the parks planning would occur on existing parkland. And so this is one of the major changes. So we aren't showing any land need for new parks in the next 20 years. And this comes right out of the parks planning process. Are there any questions about that?
The level of service was ultimately determined like the many acres per thousand?
I don't have that off the top of my head. I would have to go back to the draft plan to look at that. I'm sorry, I wasn't part of this. Do you have it here?
I think,
Up
I
there?
think it's 14.
They're small.
The numbers are really tiny. To,
Maybe the
their numbers are tiny just to reflect the fact that it is in the parks plan.
Yeah.
And I believe the desired levels per acre per thousand were 14.1.
And I'm just gonna state that was the last that we heard, but Beth, this table might have actually been revised as well.
So it's
So-
possible that what's in the final parks plan isn't quite this because,
It could
Yes,
have
because we're,
changed.
yeah, it could have changed. So this was just demonstrating what had been there previously. I don't
Okay.
have the updated table.
okay. So Kim, please ignore what I just said. And
Thanks.
it's something that we'd have to check in the parks master plan.
So that's not a conclusive statement. Not being.
No,
No,
that
the-
is a conclusive
It is a
statement.
conclusive statement because the park land need that was being shown before was for the 5 neighborhood parks that were desired. And I think at the tune of originally 5 acres each. So it was like a 25-acre land need for parkland. What finally it boiled down to was the realization that the city likely would not have funding to acquire that much land in the next 20 years. So they prioritized it differently and just said that they still wanted the 5 neighborhood parks. I think it may have gone down to 3 acres for each of those parks, but they're showing that in the master plan as beyond the 20-year horizon. So we wouldn't include that in our UGB analysis because that's looking at a 20-year horizon. And that additional parkland need would be beyond that.
So the red ink up there, where it says the city will not require new lands for parks and trails over the next 20 years, that is a conclusive statement. It's just my reading of the little tiny table. It's not right.
I'd like to state as the Parks Committee representative here, we gave our own, the committee itself gave our recommendations, and that was over 6 months ago, and we have not heard back at all. So the first time we're going to see anything back from the consultant will be December 4th at the city council meeting at 6 p.m.
I just thought I'd throw out too, if you're looking at not acquiring new land for in-town parks in 20 years, you're looking at never acquiring new land. Because there won't be any left.
Good story.
Possibly some floodplain areas. That's where I would think you'd find your,
Open space, yeah.
yeah, floodplain areas are where you're gonna find your parkland that's gonna be affordable and also probably not suitable for housing or other development.
And the other thing too, I would just point out, Jeff, is that even though the planning documents we're talking about are 20-year horizon, that's not to say that we wouldn't update it before that. And, there is a desire to investigate and find new funding sources for parks, but until that is realized, I don't know that there would be funding for it. So it's not to say that we're locked into 20 years, no new parks or acquisition. But for now, for this planning purpose, we're not considering that. In the future, again, if a funding mechanism was put into place, we would update the parks master plan and likely indicate areas where those new parks would be. And actually, this parks master plan does indicate general areas where we would like to see those new parks. So if there was a funding mechanism, we would at least know kind of what areas to look at to go after that.
Okay, so I'm going to step off of this because that wasn't necessarily the work of this group. So when we looked at the semi-public lands, and these are primarily for churches, what we did is we looked at the Creekside Baptist Church, which had a big piece of land, 8.4 acres, and that was at the suggestion of this committee. And so what we did is we decreased the acres per 1,000 people from 2 acres per 1,000 people down to 2.4, based on assuming that you wouldn't necessarily need another big church in the same way. So that took us from about 9 acres per 1,000 people over the 20-year period to 8. and from about 15 to 14. So some small changes. So we put the old analysis up top and put an X through it, and the new analysis you see in the bottom, and that's what you'll see in the memorandum. Yes, ma'am.
What would fall in the other category? Like the YMCA wanted to come. and build a
Yeah,
building, that's
things like that. Yeah, it would be pretty small. And of course, this land is going to be zoned or whatever it'll be zoned for, generally speaking, commercial or in residential or commercial. And so it's not like you're like, oh, we've only got 8 acres for, semi-public uses. If a church came in and bought, 10 acres of residential land for a new church, it's not like you wouldn't allow that. It's just that this is a 20-year forecast and we know how things change in 20 years. So. All right, so we'll go on from there. And then looking at the employment land need, this hasn't changed. What we're looking at is over the next 20 years, this is over the 30-year period, sorry. The land supply through 2043, we've got a surplus of industrial, little deficit of commercial. By 2073, we've got a smaller surplus of industrial and a larger deficit of commercial. So when we're looking at potential UGB expansion, we're looking at that 21 acres. When we're looking at potential urban reserves, we're looking at 83 acres. So we'll be calculating that in, and these are, of course, before any land use efficiency measures. We'll get to those in a few minutes. So there was no change on that one. So in the housing needs analysis, as we dug into the housing needs analysis, we understood what was done in there a little bit more and realized that there were some things that didn't make as much sense in the forecast for new land needed beyond we got the housing needs analysis revised so that it stopped at the forecast for whether there was a surplus of capacity for housing or deficit. So we didn't change most of the housing needs analysis, but we looked at assumed future densities differently than the housing needs analysis did. It assumed that future densities for the deficit would be higher than historical. So we assumed lower, we assumed at historical. And then we needed to account for rights of way for housing that were beyond the UGB. So these are small accounting issues, essentially. So what we did is, first of all, we revised the 20-year land need and said, these are the historical densities, the 4.8, the 7.6, and the 15 for these different housing types. And we said, okay, for your existing land need, if you have 226 dwelling units capacity more than you need, that's 47.4 acres. If you have a deficit of medium and high density housing at these densities, it ends up being 22.6 and 6.9 acres. The prior analysis assumed higher densities for low and medium density development. So we just assumed that it was at the historical development density. So what we are seeing in the housing needs analysis. So we didn't change this unit surplus or deficit. That's what's in your housing needs analysis. Does that make some sense? I guess maybe.
Any questions on this?
Okay. All right, and then since we know that some of this land that would be accommodated beyond the UGB wasn't accounting for rights of way, we used the same assumption for rights of way, ROW, that was used in the housing needs analysis. So on an acre of land, that 18.5% of land would be used for rights of way. And that ended up increasing your land deficit for medium density and for high density. It also increased your land surplus for low density, but that really doesn't matter here in the same way. What matters is the medium and high density, because those are deficits beyond the UGB. Yes, sir.
So question, if I'm looking at this right, saying that we need 446 acres total, is that the current number we need over the next 50 years?
I think so, but I need to get to that slide before
Okay,
I say so. I'm just trying to take this stepwise so I don't lose everybody.
So the process, okay.
I just, this is like fiddly, and I want you all to understand it as much as you want to understand it. But I think that is perhaps correct. Okay, so I'm going to go on. And so then we did the similar sort of thing, and we revised up to your 2043 to 73 deficit of acres of land. And we accounted for your existing surplus and so on and so forth. So that gets us to about 280 acres of land before land use efficiency measures through 2073. That's a little higher than we would have had we not done the accounting changes that we just did. All right. And then going through this before land use efficiency measures, what we see is like for employment lands, all your commercial land, of course, is in employment. A little bit of your semi-public land is there. A little bit of your semi-public land is in low density. And then we've got this public land concept, and it also has a little tiny bit of semi-public. And we allocated the semi-public land out based on how it's currently, how it is in the existing UGB. So a little bit of it is in commercial, some is in low density, a little tiny bit is in your public plan designation. So we got through 2043 a 71 acre deficit, all told, and then 2043 to 73, 375 acre deficit when we put all of that together. And so that's before land use efficiency measures. So I'm going to continue on. And the land use efficiency measures that we discussed, increasing density by 3% across residential plan designations. And that would take into account the change you would get from decreasing your lot sizes, as we talked about many months ago with Heather. And the 3% increase is not actually based on calculations for those specific lot sizes. It's based on an assumption that we can make based on Oregon state law that allows us to say safely, without any other proof, that we can assume a 3% density across residential plan designations. And then looking at rezoning selected parcels, which we talked about in a prior meeting. And then for employment, we've also looked at rezoning selected parcels. So your public land need, it's not impacted by these efficiency measures. Those are the efficiency measures that we talked about. And when you do all of the little accounting, it moves things around a little bit. So your high density deficit is mostly taken care of by rezoning that 7 acres of land that we talked about to say your A1 zone. Your medium density deficit goes up because we're rezoning 8 acres of land into high density. And then we're also looking at rezoning 2.9 acres of land from low density. So we come out in the end with a 33 acre deficit for medium density, almost no deficit for high density, and then low density, a little surplus still. So that's when you account for the land use efficiency measures. And then if we put this all together, let's see, this is the change before and after the 3% change in densities. It's a very small change because it's only 3% increase. So it's a 3% decrease, sort of ish. in your total. I'm not saying that these numbers equal out to a 3% change. But when we feed it through all of the models and all of that, it's a 3% change. A little modest change. And employment, we did the same sort of thing. We are, proposing to rezone 11 acres of industrial to commercial, and that takes your commercial deficit down to 10 acres. And then when we put it all together, after land use efficiency measures, we're looking at a deficit of 59 acres over the 20-year period and a deficit of 360 acres between 2043 and 73. And if we added those two numbers together, which I don't want to do because I'll do it wrong, that would be the total for the 50-year. So 59 plus 360.
19.
Thank you.
What was our deficit before all these revisions? Or what did it change from before?
So it's shown right above 71 plus 375, 446. So it was 446, and now it comes down to 59 plus 360.
We had parks in there before.
We had parks in there. There were 20 some
Earlier.
acres of parks.
So the
27 acre change.
So the 446 number was prior all the revisions and the 3%.
Yep.
efficiencies.
Most of that change is parkland.
And then the net, so the new net need is 419.
Yes,
Over 50 years.
over the 50-year period. And as we go forward into the UGB work, we have to treat those two numbers differently. So we're treating them differently here. So that is our essentially accounting changes. And as we look through at the UGB, I think we're looking a little bit more at potential for rezoning residential land, some of your low density residential land. We haven't done that work yet, but so the numbers for medium density might go down a little bit. But that's the other big change that might come, and it's not that big a change.
You mentioned rezoning some land into industrial 10 acres. Do you have parcels in mind yet, or is that something that we're not really?
We talked about that previously, and I don't happen to have that.
There's some, yeah, I know, and I don't know if it's the total acreage, but there were two parcels. I want to say it was maybe closer to 8 acres. So maybe there was another area too, but it's actually at the north end of West Lane Road.
Okay.
And we're talking about buildable acres, not including land in the floodplain,
No.
that kind of thing.
We're talking.
On the west side of West Lane at the north end.
Okay, so Parker's.
No, Dave Maloney.
Oh, Dave Maloney, who used to be in the city, isn't in the city now, maybe back into the city.
I don't think he's looking to annex in right away, but he already has commercial uses on the his northern parcel there, and had an interest in rezoning his southern parcel also to commercial, which frankly, since it's there, kind of on that corner and sort of the entrance into the airport and that corridor there is going to get built out, it kind of made sense to potentially have some additional commercial there.
Okay, thank you.
So that is the end of that part, but I want to answer questions if you have them.
So I guess my question is, with the parks, says there's no need for future land for parks, but there can always be land that's used for parks, right?
Certainly, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, the city can buy any land that is
Or
vacant.
take land that's given to them and
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
zone it to
Yeah.
accommodate parks.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any other questions on this?
I have one thought. It's kind of interesting as I watched the process. On one side, we want to increase green spaces and increase tree canopy. But on the other hand, we're going to smaller lots for residential. And when you have smaller lots in residential, you have less trees. So it's an interesting process to watch, the kind of almost trying to figure out how to get trees out of smaller and smaller lots. And I'm not saying there's a good answer, but it's an interesting process, and I think we just all should be very aware of it because it creates potential problems for, homeowners, developers, and the community at large, as far as getting enough trees in. But now we're, instead of having a 70-foot wide backyard, that's 40 feet deep, you may have a 30 or 40-foot wide backyard that's 30 feet deep. You're not
Right.
going to get as many trees in it.
I think that has implications if you're going to have any policies around tree cover related to residential areas, that you'd need to account for that.
And it also gets into things like parts of Lake Oswego. Most of Lake Oswego was, or I shouldn't say most, a large percentage of Lake Oswego was developed a while ago. So the lots tend to be larger. And that's one of the reasons why, besides their tree laws, is why they have such a high canopy rate, is that when you're on a 1/4 acre house, single house parcel, you're going to have room for more trees than you are when you're on a 6,000 square foot or smaller lot. So there's something to I think everybody should be conscious of as far as the process. Anyhow, that's it.
I think the smaller lots and the density is to preserve the land outside of the city as well. And
It is, and to increase
having
affordability.
people live next to where the infrastructure is and
Right.
less expensive overall if people are living in the city where all the infrastructure is, and instead of growing the infrastructure out,
That's right.
using the infrastructure within the city,
More efficiently.
which protects the environment outside the city.
That is Oregon's land use system in a nutshell. So, yeah. So our next steps are to continue the UGB and urban reserves analysis and continue working on the comp plan updates. And as Laurie mentioned, we've got some zoning code updates that we'll be doing, and we'll be bringing information to the city council at as yet unset meetings. I expect we will certainly be at the next town meeting in Berlish. And the next SAC meeting, I'm sure it won't be in January. We'll be talking about scheduling that, and we'll be checking in with Chair Kessie about that.
Likely February.
February, March, yeah.
We're March, and then the last SEC meeting, when is that? The end of 2024?
Probably May or so, maybe a little later.
No, it's in the fall.
For this committee,
This
meeting
committee.
would be more May, June.
Yeah, when we have the 50-year plan.
The actual document
itself
pulled together.
drafted.
Okay.
And then you'd go into working with City Council and Planning Commission on adoption and that kind of thing. That just takes a while. So there's where we are.
We can see the end.
We can see the end.
One final question. Are we actually going to start looking at land for this 400 and some acres? Okay, so
That's the analysis.
that's the February meeting. So that's going to be a big meeting.
It might not be the February meeting, but it will be a meeting where we'll bring
Yeah.
it back.
Soon.
And that's going to be largely based on there's a few places that the city is going to be driven to based on where you can grow in terms of exceptions areas, and then looking really hard at water, wastewater, roads, so costs of services are certainly going to be a big consideration. Then there's some other considerations also, because the city certainly does not want to bring in land that is harder to service, more expense. So, all right, thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, this meeting's adjourned. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight.
Thank you.